Good evening. I'm Marion Dry, Chair of Class Act HR 73, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this Class Act webinar, Creating a 501c3. Class Act HR 73 was founded 10 years ago, and not long after, we developed our Bridge program. The Bridge program supports classmates and nonprofit organizations they sponsor by matching them with volunteers from the class who donate their expertise to assist these organizations in reaching their goals. 3 Class Act board members, Lee Haffrey, Rick Weil, and Stan Mark, oversee the Bridge program and have devised this new webinar series as an outreach not only to HR 73 classmates, but to other classes that have started their own class acts and indeed to the whole alumni community. I'd now like to introduce our speaker, Leonard Easter, who is my classmate, class of 73, has a JD from Columbia, and is a New York attorney specializing in not-for-profit and exemption law with specific focus on 501c3 formation and operations for local, state, federal, and international arts and cultural institutions and organizations. Leonard told me yesterday he has formed about 600 such legal entities for clients, so he truly knows what he's talking about. Leonard serves on the boards of various institutions and has produced opera, major fundraising events, and other artistic presentations. When he has time to breathe, he's consumed with playing the piano. Leonard, let me turn it over to you. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you, and thank all of you for coming to this webinar. I wish that I had obtained this type of information before I started practicing in the area. But the purpose, or let's say my aim this evening, is to give you a general idea and orientation of how to form, or let's say how to obtain 501c3 status. We're going to walk through somewhat the steps from formation to actually achieving that status. But before we do, let me give you an understanding of what C3 is. 501c3 is a section of the Internal Revenue Code. And it is a section, one of about 27, that lists those types of entities or concerns that may qualify for exemption from federal income tax and other taxes. So this is a federal statute. It couples with 170 of the Internal Revenue Code, which states that qualified contributions to 501c3 qualified entities may qualify for a charitable deduction. So classification under 501c3 gives a two-prong advantage. The organization or entity is tax exempt, and qualified contributions are deductible as charitable contributions. To obtain 501c3, an entity or a concern has to navigate through very many different levels, from legal formation to organization to actually applying for the exemption and for being categorized as specifically being described under section 501c3. 501c3 is a list of categories, but in general, it covers charitable, religious, and educational type concerns or organizations. 501c3 mentions that an entity must be organized and operated exclusively for charitable or educational purposes, that there is no what they call private inurement, no substantial legislative activity, and absolutely no political activity. So that's the IRS's purview to characterize whether an activity, whether an organization meets those qualifications. There's an application process to achieve it, and there is a best way to approach that application. And as some lawyers would say, the tail wags the dog. The best way to get 501c3 status is to form on a local level a nonprofit organization or corporation, to achieve tax exempt status at various levels, and to make the argument that the organization should be considered as charitable or educational. Now, what qualifies for an organization approaching the application for C3 status? Well, corporations or corporate structure is the best one to use. And corporations are formed at a state level, or in the case of the District of Columbia, the district. And state laws usually govern or have their qualifications for what constitutes a nonprofit corporation, not-for-profit corporation, what have you. So there are specific steps outlined in state law. I'm a New York attorney, so I'm very familiar with what New York expects in a document to justify its being categorized as a nonprofit, or, as New York attorneys would say, a not-for-profit corporation. And there are other states that have other qualifications, other standards, other laws that govern the formation of the entity. So the entity starts locally. It is bound by local law as to how it is formed. And again, I usually emphasize forming a corporation, a nonprofit, not-for-profit, non-stock, whatever the local sort of state designates, gets it to something that looks charitable. Now, you see there's a difference in terms. Nonprofit doesn't necessarily mean charitable. There are many different types of nonprofit entities. It includes charitable, but not necessarily. It includes exempt entities, but not necessarily. In fact, if you just form a nonprofit corporation, it is subject to taxation unless it applies for and receives recognition of exemption. The rule of thumb is every tax at each level has some type of application which governs how you get out of it. So in forming these entities, I start at the beginning and I fashion a corporation that not only satisfies state law, but reflects what I'm going for, that 501c3. Everything about it describes the entity, its purposes, objectives, its name even, and mentioning the various clauses that I want this organization to land on. In New York, you can form a not-for-profit corporation and not even mention 501c3, which is federal. But if I do that, if I do not mention that status when I go to the IRS for approval, I won't get it. So rule number one, make sure that from the beginning, the document, the corporate structure, everything points to the resulting 501c3 designation that you seek. One example of that is I tell my clients, even the name of the entity can help you or can hinder you. If the name of the entity points too much to a private interest rather than a public benefit, when I get to the IRS stage, there's a possibility that the IRS will say, well, this is somebody else's alter ego. This aggrandizes an individual rather than benefits the public in a charitable or educational way. So care must be taken in creating the structure. So let's say I get through this, I form a not-for-profit corporation. Some things that I recommend, in some states you can do this with only one director. The IRS frowns on this. I suggest you have at least three persons to serve on the board. The qualifications, the requirements for those 3 people are governed by state law, but the composition of the board will either help or hinder you when you get to apply for federal exemption under 501c3. The second step after incorporating is pulling together the organizational structure, drafting bylaws, creating minutes, basically doing the care and feeding of this corporate entity. And after doing that, applying to the feds for 501c3 status. There is a formidable application called Form 1023, which asks a number of terrible questions, asking what the organization plans to do financially through its activities and operations that will support a finding that it is charitable. I mean, one of the questions in 1023 is, please tell us what your activities are or what you plan to do. What steps do you have to take to be fully operational, and when will those steps be completed? It asks for a lot of information so that a very, an IRS agent who is not really, it's not in their temperament to exempt from tax, they collect tax, to go and to convince that person, that body, that this entity should be exempt. So as much in perspective information as possible is supported to show what reasonably can be expected in the life of this entity. Which brings me to one problem that a lot of entities have faced going to the IRS. On Form 1023, the long form, it asks for financial projections. And I've had many organizations go and approach, and they project deficits because they say that, well, it's nonprofit, it shouldn't be making any money. I had one agent laugh and call me up and said, look, this is a projection. If you're projecting deficits, in actuality, you're going to be deeper, and how are you going to benefit anyone? You're just going to be struggling for existence rather than being able to carry programs out. So there has to be definite, not wishful thinking, but some type of hope that the entity will be stable, that will be able to serve the public, showing in general that it is charitable and educational. Now, there are all kinds of activities and operations that have been deemed to be charitable and educational. The legal practice is articulating the aims of an organization, so they're defined by and fall under those categories. So I'll give you an example. One once in my career, I took a rock band and I got 501c3 status because I was able to show that the entity was going to educate the public to a better appreciation of yada, yada, yada. It was the articulation of the purposes and objectives and operations of this band, which is still alive, to educate the public. There are other entities where it's the articulation, the rationale that can fall under 501c3. Some are really out there. I think I got C3 status once for a witches coven. I've had various dance companies, theater companies. I tend to lean toward cultural. But 501c3 does not list cultural as one of the categories for which exemption is given. The cultural aspect has to be interpreted and defined under charitable or educational in order for the IRS to be comfortable in recognizing that status. The process for getting 501c3 status, it takes a while. Everything's computerized now. Everything's online. In going for the long form, it could take up to 6 months to a year for, once the application is in, to get a ruling. There are exceptions. The IRS did institute a short form for organizations that did not anticipate significant support, at least during the early years of its existence. It's a 1023 EZ. It's another online filing. And I think the last time I submitted one for a client, I was able to achieve the C3 status in about 2 weeks. So this is a big difference. And some entities want exempt status yesterday. So in some circumstances, there's a quick route, but the long route takes quite some time. Once the C3 status has been achieved, some clients have been under the mistaken notion that there's a federal exemption number. There is no such thing and never has been. There is the determination letter. It is a pronouncement by the IRS that an entity has been recognized on the basis of its application to be charitable and educational, and therefore to be recognized under 501c3, to which qualified contributions are deductible. There is a thing called an employer ID number, which is just a basic number that's given to a possible employer or taxpayer. And every entity that approaches the IRS has to have a number before it goes and applies for exempt status. You know, I'm getting a little long-winded here, so I'm going to start putting the brakes. As you can see, there are so many considerations. What I would leave you with at this point, and then open for questions, is during this whole process, in the beginning, specific planning is so important. Looking 5 years out, financially, proposed activities, operations, being able to articulate, that is very important. Another thing is on a corporate level or organizational level, consistently asking the question, what it is that the organization is doing, on a day-to-day basis to justify its qualification under section 501c3, because what the IRS taketh, the IRS, give it, they can take it away. So there is a constant duty on staying qualified and justify that existence. Another way to put it, what does nonprofit actually mean in this context? And how do you show that you have remained a nonprofit entity? If I can just throw in one more thing, because it's my pet peeve. One of the most important pieces of paper or series of papers that an entity can maintain are minutes, board minutes, because minutes will show your process, hopefully reflect activities, basically show that duties and responsibilities are seriously being followed, articulated. So minutes can save you. Minutes can show your good faith. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, but good faith is a mitigating factor. So good faith is always relevant in any of these processes. And to keep asking questions, keep looking at the entity, keep tweaking it to make sure that it remains qualified under 501c3. Now, after all that, that was sort of all over the place, but I'd like to take your questions so I can narrow it to assist you. I recommend that you do not ask me any questions that, let's say, are on the edge of legality questions. I had one session once where I was speaking to a group of people, and someone posed a question which was delicate, and that happened to be that an IRS agent was in the audience, and that didn't help that person to be somewhat exposed. So general questions are definitely appropriate and welcome.
Hello, I want to thank you for this wonderful webinar. I have a question here that I could put in the chat. Does it make sense to file the EZ 1023 form to get up and running as soon as possible, knowing that at some point you need to transition? If a transition is needed, is it a difficult one? What is that process like? You just have to file the regular 1023.
That's a great question. Most of the organizations I deal with who are just beginning and really don't have a clear financial picture, they do the easy. The easy it's somewhat painless. It is appropriate if an organization looking at a multi-year period anticipates less than $50K a year in support. And if an organization is just starting, it's all conjecture anyway. So I have a lot of organizations will go in using a 1023 EZ. If they actually bounce up and go above that level, then they just do the regular filing. But here's the rub. The IRS requires every C3 to at least in a 3-year period to file once. Otherwise, the C3 is automatically revoked. So there are some entities that are so low base, they don't bother filing, unfortunately. And because they're below the radar screen. And if they continue that for a 3-year period of not filing, the C3 is yanked. So I would say, yes, you can go in on a 1023 EZ if you project low. And if you bounce high, you would do the regular 990 EZ or the regular 990. So yeah, Um, I think that answers your question.
So you
Thank
would do
you.
the EZ, then just do the regular 990 then, right? It's a separate form. It's a follow-up
Those, well,
clarification.
what happens is if you do the easy, and let's say you stay below 50K, there is a 990N, which is an online postcard filer. And it's like name, address, who's your president, are you still alive? And that's filed. That can be filed anytime in the tax year. And it's online, it takes 5 minutes. But once you bubble up and get to that level where a 990 EZ should be filed, then you just file it. You just file it. Or the 990 if you are successful in garnering your support.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Our next question comes from Letitia. Letitia, if you would mute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I had a kind of a two-pronged question. I mean, one is about how, I'm in Massachusetts, how you'd recommend going about finding a lawyer that could help you with your bylaws and some, sort of shepherd one through this. Does it need to be a nonprofit, someone who specializes in nonprofit or not? And then the particular situation we're in is we're actually changing the name of a 501c3. So if you had any thoughts about how difficult that is, that would be helpful.
And that's a good question. First, I mean, I'm on the edge of retirement. I keep trying to get out from under this. And if I had to refer my clients to someone who does what I do, I'd be hard pressed. This is not a lucrative area of practice because nonprofit is not a lot of money. But I would start informationally going to the Secretary of State and looking at their documentation. And sometimes they do have or can recognize people in the state who are well versed in this area. Now, Massachusetts is very interesting because it's not the state of Massachusetts, it's the Commonwealth. And there are some very interesting laws that apply. And there's a different nomenclature that's used for certain things and processes than New York. So someone who's familiar locally with the situation is where you want to go. In terms of changing the name of the entity, that's usually done by state process. The problem it used to be a problem that if one changed the name of an entity, the IRS used to view that as a substantial change in the organization, and that it had to go to the IRS for approval of that, not approval, but recognition that that change of name did not upset it remaining qualified under 501c3. They've softened up a bit on that and there are devices that are often used to inform the IRS of a change in name. If you file a 990 under Section O, information can be given. They've softened up a bit as to whether just a sheer change of name affects qualifications. But in the old days, if I changed in New York, if I amended the certificate and changed the name, it's almost like going back to the IRS all over again to be qualified all over again. But it's not quite the circumstance. There are some trap doors when you change a name. There are some jurisdictions that allow you not to necessarily change the name, but adopt a name for quote unquote doing business or having an assumed name. So that would not require an amendment, but a simple filing. A lot of people do that in New York, and for change of name purposes and for branding purposes. So there are all kinds of ways. Things shift consistently here, but there are ways that you can adopt another name without having undue scrutiny from the IRS.
Thank you. Catherine Kripke, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for this great presentation and discussion. I really appreciate it. So is there kind of a rule of thumb, like how much money one should budget for a lawyer to help set up a 501c3, or does it just really depend on the specifics of the organization and how complex it is? Like, is there a range?
I can't comment on that, but I can say it's, this is a peculiar specialty, and sometimes the more peculiar your specialties are, sometimes the higher the price is. It just really depends. I'm not going to tell you what I charge, but it can go around the block. Sometimes you have lawyers who will go, depending upon the type of entity, and they're convinced to do a pro bono or at a very low rate. So I would try to sell the thing to somebody. And again, it's not just a lawyer. You could, if you know what you're doing, do this without an attorney. It's not that you need an attorney. You need someone who knows what they're doing, who will not get you stuck. For example, somebody might go and you want to do this very quickly, and they might draft a certificate of incorporation or articles that do not contain 501c3 language. You get it incorporated, you go to the IRS and they say, yep, you got to include this stuff. Then you got to go back to the beginning, redo everything and approach them again. And time is money. So you should try to get someone who has done this before and is aware of the various laws and the various conflicts of law. Certain terminology at one level means something else in another. So there's a certain navigation that has to happen through all these levels. It can be done. It can be done quickly in some circumstances. I mean, I'll just tell you one example. I had an entity. I incorporated them in one day, and I went to the IRS, and in a week I had the C3. I mean, it can be done, but it takes someone who's been doing this a while and who's also familiar with the bureaucratic backup that happens online. Being able to navigate online process is crucial. A lot of my battles are not just with the IRS agents, but you can't get on the phone unless you wait for 3 hours with a computer. And I'm familiar enough with those battles to circumvent. The best circumvention you can do is to get your papers done correctly.
Karen Orlin, you've asked a question in the chat. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask that question? And after you, then we'll take Robin Pope.
An organization is formed with an educational purpose, but it's formed as an LLC so that the sole owner of the organization can deduct the expenses, the substantial expenses during the early years before a financial sponsor is found. And then lo and behold, a financial sponsor, a 501c entity or a foundation appears. White, as it were. Is it necessary for the LLC to reorganize as a not-for-profit in order to affiliate with that 501c3 for a foundation? I mean, some of them require it. Some of them, I understand, don't necessarily require it. What is your experience with that?
You're talking about a sponsorship type.
Yes, affiliate sponsorship, right?
Yeah. Some of those sponsorships used to be encouraged by the Internal Revenue Service because it was a way for entities that were not ready to support a corporate structure and the fiduciary duties that spilled from them. It was a way for them to incubate to see whether they had the solidity to eventually go out on their own and get their own status. So the sponsorship relationship, it's basically, we used to call it a conduit. But, you know, when lawyers start using plumbers' terms, we're getting to the edge of legality sometimes. And it's basically utilizing a sponsor that is, it's an entity, it's 501c3 entity, to accept contributions, qualified contributions, and in some way filter them down, to re-grant them down, to repay them down to a project, an affiliated entity, what have you.
Mhm.
I would recommend in that circumstance that there be a sponsorship agreement and that there be some process by the 501c3 entity that what they are raining this money on, that it falls under their exempt purposes and objectives. Otherwise, it may look like it's going to fluff up an individual and their needs. And there's the nuclear option word is private inurement. If it looks as though a particular person is benefiting because they are juxtaposed to an organization, almost like partners with it or whatever, then there could be a finding of private inurement, and the sponsor C3 could be yanked
Mhm.
by the service. So there should be an agreement. And the agreement would lock the sponsored entity in on being accountable, making sure the monies were only used for 501c3 purposes, and yada, yada. You know, that's the thing about the LLCs, though. You know, it's fairly recent vintage that LLCs have been able to enter into this area. In fact, it used to be that the IRS said that you could not, if you were an LLC, obtain 501c3 status. But now you can. A bunch of us jumped up and down, sort of tested the waters, and we got some of these things through with a bit of articulation. So C3s in this area, that's where the excitement is now. And some some LLCs are approaching and getting their own C3 status. The IRS has a list of 12 qualifications or requirements for an LLC that is approaching to get its own C3 status. However, on a local level, there are some states that do not allow an LLC to be for anything other than a business purpose, and therefore locked out of directly applying for 501c3 status. And New York is one of those states.
So Leonard, we have Robin Pope who's going to, I would ask her to unmute herself, and then there are two questions in the chat, and then I think we may need to stop for the evening. But so Robin, would you unmute yourself?
Yes, good evening,
Good evening.
and thank you for the great information. I have a question. It's similar to Karen Orland's. Orland, I've established an LLC in Texas, and it is educational based, but I wanted to offer the product to the community for those who are not able to pay.
Right.
So I wanted to know, would a 501c3 be needed to do that? Because I wasn't sure if I wanted to apply for funds to help the sector of the community that can't pay for it. I was wondering, is there a way to receive funds and be an LLC? Or most corporations only want to give to a 501c3 for tax purposes? So that was my question.
Yeah, that gets into an interesting area. I mean, technically, I'm not sure about Texas law, but I think it does allow. It's pretty freewheeling sometimes. And I think an LLC, if it does follow the regulations, the Internal Revenue Code, then it could qualify itself for 501c3 status. But you know, the thing is, it brings up an interesting point. 501, the attraction of having a 501c3 status is the ability to take in qualified, contributions, and that may be deductible. Most people, and that deduction is meaningful only if you itemize. So if you don't itemize your deductions, you're not giving because of the effect, the deductibility in and of itself. That's just not a magnet for that. There are some entities that see achieving C3 status as the IRS's proof that, they're finding that you're charitable. And that tends to be a draw across the board, not necessarily the effect of the deduction, but because of the labeling of the qualifying under that section. So from a practical basis, that getting C3 status often puts a nonprofit entity in a recognized benevolent position. But if I were just being technical and wanted to get more money out of my deduction, instead of giving it to a charity, where if I itemize, the net effect of the deduction comes off my adjusted gross income, I might just take a business expense, which comes off at a higher rate, 100%. So if I'm looking for the effect, the deductible effect, you might find business deductions do it. But 501c3 tends to give the blessing of the IRS that this entity is recognized as charitable. And that recognition is useful to show or to prove other exemptions. For example, in New York State, if I want to get out of sales tax, which some people want to get out of more than anything, it's very easy if I've gotten a 501c3 finding first. If I haven't, and I approach the Department of Taxation and Finance and apply for exemption from sales tax, the application is as bad, can be worse than applying for 501c3 status from the feds. So it can be used as proof. The federal government says you're charitable. So it's persuasive for other taxes or tax exemptions.
Leonard, this has been fantastic. So many people have already expressed their thanks to you for giving us so much information. And we are grateful to be able to have experts like you in our class who can share this kind of understanding and knowledge with our greater Harvard communities. Thank you so much. Thank you, Leonard. Thank you all who attended, and good evening.